Hello, everybody. My name is Marc Bernstein, and this is Sales Training from My Couch. Really excited to have you all here today. Today, we're going to go over storytelling, how to do it, why it's important, and a couple of very practical applications for how you can tell stories on your sales calls. So the name of the training today is Tell Stories, Close Deals, because that's what we're all going to be doing. The topics we'll be covering. First is how to get good at telling stories. Then we'll talk a little bit about why stories are important. 5 elements of a great story, 3 times you want to use storytelling in your sales calls. And then we're actually going to, in our activity today, have 3 brave volunteers tell a story to the group. So if you think you might be willing to volunteer for that, try to get yourself pumped up throughout the training because we'll take 5 minutes at the end, have everyone think about a story that you can tell, and then tell that story to the group. So it seems only fitting that we start off today's training with a story. In 2015, I was reading this book called To Sell is Human by Dan Pink. And what he talks about is the very natural part of sales, which is people communicating back and forth in order to exchange resources, and how everything in life is a sale, from getting your kid to eat their breakfast, to getting someone to pay attention at school, to actual sales. Everything is a sale. And one of the things he mentions that is so important is telling stories. So I read this book, I got all pumped up. I went to one of my sales calls, and I remember telling the buyer a story, and then I kind of paused and waited for quiet. The buyer goes, "Ha!" It was like the fakest laugh I had ever heard, and I was like, oh, geez, I probably need to get better at this. So I bought Aesop's Fables, the book Aesop's Fables, and there's like more fables than you can possibly imagine there. It's like 300 or something. And then it was December, and I made a goal for every day in December to call up one of my friends or family members and tell them one story. Which, by the way, as you can imagine, sometimes they'd say, "Hey, Marc, how's it going?" And I said, "Hey, I kind of have to call you because I'm telling a story today. Can you listen?" And after a little while, they got it. Well, how it ended up is that I practiced that entire month, and then only a couple years later, I was doing a one-on-one with someone at Balto, where we were each talking about the other person's strengths and the other person's areas of improvement. And the person I was talking to said, "Marc, one of the things that I'm so impressed with is your ability to tell stories." And I said, wow, I definitely was not always that way. And it took a lot of practice, took a lot of time. So the moral of that story there is that with telling stories to your customers, like everything, you have to practice. It is not, even though it feels like a very natural thing to learn, it's not easy. And there's a lot of differing pieces to it that you want to keep in mind. So this is actually one of the Aesop's Fables that was my favorite, that stuck with me in the book, and I'm actually going to read it to you guys now. A scorpion and a frog meet on the bank of a stream, and the scorpion asks the frog to carry him across on its back. The frog asks, "How do I know you won't sting me?" The scorpion says, "Because if I do, I'll die too." The frog is satisfied, and they set out, but in midstream, the scorpion stings the frog. The frog feels the onset of paralysis and starts to sink, knowing they will both drown, but has just enough time to gasp, "Why?" Replies the scorpion, "It's my nature." So that was actually an interesting lesson, in addition to just a good story, which is that sometimes you need to take people and things at face value. You can't just change everything around you. You just got to adapt to how things are. Well, this story has a bunch of really interesting components. The first is context. It starts out describing where the scorpion and frog are on the bank, and kind of paints a picture for you of what's going on. Because before you start reading, you're not thinking about a scorpion, a frog, or a bank, or anything. And the story needs to set the stage. Next thing there is that we see a conflict. Something tense, something surprising, something unexpected. Easy sailing does not make for a good story. When everything goes well, it does not make for a good story. You want there to be something that might be in question or might not go so well, and that creates a little bit of enjoyable tension. So how do I know you won't sting me? That's the thing that we see introduced here. Then it has imagery. This is so important to be putting vivid details into the stories you tell. And notice how it talks about the frog feels the onset of paralysis. You can imagine what that feels like, and starts to sink, knowing that they will both drown. And you can picture how this frog is so surprised. And it's like, wait a minute, I just got stung, as it's in midstream. And it gasps. Why? How can we make sure that we're telling stories with a lot of imagery? There's a resolution. And that is that at the end of the story, you have to know how it ends. Now, that's not always true, obviously. There are times where not knowing how it ends can be interesting or exciting, but particularly in sales, your buyers probably don't want to know how it ends. And the last is a moral. A moral just simply needs to be a good reason that you told the story. It needs to be clear that the reason you just spent all of your words is to make the other person's life better in some way, shape, or form. And in this case, that's the moral. Well, those 5 things are the 5 elements of any great story. Of course, different people might have different views on that, but that's the general rule of thumb, is that when you're starting a story, you want to set the stage with some context, describe what's going on, introduce some sort of conflict or tension, something you don't know, something that might be surprising. Make sure you're using a whole lot of imagery so the details are very vivid. People can picture it, they can feel it. Make sure that you wrap the story up. I think we've all had that scenario where one of our friends is telling us a story, and when they end it, you're like, is that the end? Is that it? And they're like, oh yeah, that was it. So you got to make sure that you wrap the story up so people know that the story was actually over. And then the last is some reason or interpretation for that story or moral, which, by the way, does not need to be explicit, but is something that's important to include regardless. So now let's take it to the sales call. When you are on a sales call, when do you want to tell a story? And there are 3 situations, 3 times where it makes a whole lot of sense to tell stories on your sales calls. The first is when you're framing a situation. The second is when your buyer brings up an objection or concern. And the third is when you're delivering value. Let's start with framing a situation. If everyone would mind taking a second and closing your eyes, I'll actually do it too. What does your desk at your office look like? Try to picture it. Now, I'm going to see if I can put some details in there to help. Do you think you have a charger on your desk? Is there a water bottle? Any mugs? Do you have any papers or files sitting on your desk? Is your chair pushed in or is your chair pulled out? Those are the sort of things that allow the person you are talking to frame their own image. You are bringing something up. They go, aha, good point. I totally forgot. I do have a water bottle on my desk. In terms of sales, that's a very similar situation where when your buyer can't quite picture some bit of information that you might be asking, you can tell a story to help them picture that information. Here's an example. Let's imagine that you ask your buyer, what are 2 or 3 things that you wish your sales folks would do better in every call? And they go, gosh, I have no idea. You can say, hey, I totally get it. I was actually walking through a sales floor just the other week. And as I'm walking through the sales floor, I see one of the sales reps stand up and take their headset and throw it down. And I go, ugh, that person grilled me. And the person next to them said, what were they grilling you about? And they said, they just kept asking question after question, and I couldn't respond. I couldn't ask my own questions. And I realized that one of the things that sales reps struggle with is keeping control of the call. So that's one of the common things we see. Do you guys experience that at all? So notice how I told the story in order to help them conjure up some information that might be difficult to remember or think about. With objections and concerns, there's an objection handling method that some of us may have heard of and some of us might not, and they call it feel, felt, found. The idea behind feel, felt, found is those are the 3 points that you include in your objection handle. So if someone says, I think I'm going to go with the competition, the feel, felt, found approach might say, hey, I totally understand how you feel. We had a customer, Acme Co., that also felt the same way and was trying to go with competition too. However, when they spoke to the competition, they spoke with us, they found that having real-time guidance while you're live on the phone was the real make or break factor that allowed them to get a good ROI from their coaching tool. So with that being said, let me ask, how important is real-time guidance to you? So that's the idea behind feel, felt, found. You don't actually need to say the words feel, felt, and found, but the principle behind it is that you're starting with acknowledging that you understand their concern or their objection. You are letting them know that you've seen it before and saying other people, customers, buyers, your friends, your family, whoever, other people have felt the exact same way. And then you're showing the solution. You're saying, but there was some information that they learned, that they discovered they didn't know. And they found that whatever the overcome is for the objection. So what would that be for you? So an example of when you can use storytelling is feel, felt, found. And that's particularly useful for any sort of objection where you really do feel like other customers overcame that successfully. If it's an objection that you can't quite put your finger on, where maybe it's unique to that customer or tends to be a hang up for your deal, it'll be a little bit difficult to do this. But if you want to communicate to your buyer that that scenario happens all the time and it always goes well, using feel, felt, found and telling a story is a great way to do that. So then last, we talked about delivering value. And when you're telling a story about your value, about your solution, what you want to do is, in as much detail as possible, describe the promised land. In how much detail can you help your buyer picture how great life will be after they purchase your solution? A story is a great way to do that. So this is a great chance to use a customer story. If you have a customer that had a similar situation to the buyer you're talking to, and the buyer says, I think you guys could solve it. I'm just not sure. I'd have to see it. That's a great way to say, well, let me actually explain to you how this other customer did it. And here is exactly what it looks like in their environment and how they use it and the success they're seeing. Try to help your buyer picture as much detail as possible what the promised land looks like, because the more detail you can provide, the realer it feels. And the last point of a story, which is, by the way, difficult for all of us, is don't be boring. It's really easy when you're telling a story to not include enough detail, to not say something of value, or to drag on for quite some time. All of us are guilty of it, definitely me included. And keep this in the back of your head, which is that the whole point of telling the story is it should be fun, it should be exciting, it shouldn't be a formality that you have to do in order to earn the customer's business.